Good morning. This is Rima Jolove. I'm the director of the Improving Maternal Health Measurement Project, and you know me by now. I am here to present the results from the end of Objective 2 and to share with you the rich inputs that you've provided over the last few weeks, and also to offer you my thanks for completing all of these. You've heard speaker presentations. We've had semi-structured discussion forums, which have been incredibly rich, and then you've taken surveys, and so we're very excited to present to you those results. And we hope that you found it interesting and engaging. We know this is a tough time, and there are many demands on your attention and on your time, and so we're grateful for your engagement and hope that you found it interesting and stimulating as well. So in this presentation, I'm going to do my best to summarize the inputs. We have results from each of the construct-specific surveys that you took and an attempt to summarize the main discussion points to take forward into small groups or to support decisions not to move forward in the case where that might be the decision. And then the next steps, just to briefly touch on them now, you have been asked to fill out doodle polls to find a time when your small group can meet for an hour. What we envision is, so you've been assigned to a group. We've tried our best to accommodate groups within compatible time zones, and then to have a diversity and not put us together with our close colleagues or people from our same organization, try to have a little bit of diversity of expertise. We will set up the week for each construct similarly to an Objective 2, where you'll have a discussion forum and time to talk. There'll be some inputs and then a Zoom meeting. And so we really, again, ask for your engagement and participation. There's no way this can work without you. So thank you so much for playing along with us. We really are grateful and hope you're finding it stimulating and interesting. Okay, with no further ado, I will jump in and present the results for the surveys and that you took regarding construct 1.1, which, as we know, is an existing indicator, an SDG indicator with a modification that was requested. The original request was to add empowerment, the construct of empowerment, and also to specify that the informed and empowered decisions regard the timing and number of births. We in the project tried to distill that construct down to its core critical component, and our attempt at that was an indicator that measures women's decision-making power around timing and number of births. And so let's see what you all thought. The first thing is we asked you, what is the critical component, the operative word or words or phrases that embody or define the construct for measurement in this request? And here is what you see in the slide below. Decision-making power came out as really the strongest, then that combination of informed and empowered, and then a little bit more around empowerment, informed decisions, reproductive autonomy. So very clear kind of hierarchy. And what's interesting, let's see what the next question. The next question we asked, what is the construct that best expresses the specific measurement gap? And here it's interesting to see that that decisional autonomy did not come out exactly as it looked in the word cloud. Overall empowerment regarding sexual and reproductive health and rights with a focus on necessary exemplars, so disaggregated by different conditions, and then decisional autonomy and agency to realize sexual and reproductive choices. So I think it will be very interesting to see how those tensions or complexity can be resolved. There was a very strong consensus to move forward to try to develop a full definition of metadata. for this, and there are a few things to resolve. So we will, as I said in the introduction, we'll come back to you with a few clarifying questions and then a final poll to reach consensus on what exactly we should be trying to develop. And then a summary of discussion points. I'm not going to read through all of these, but I will say that these slides will be posted for your small group to consider and move refer to as you move forward. There was some general considerations around ways to measure reproductive autonomy, ways to get at decision-making power, the distinction between decision-making power and control or over the outcome, the relationship between autonomy and empowerment, how to measure whether decisions are informed, and what about voluntary joint decision-making within a couple. Some concrete ideas about how to measure empowerment, whether decisions made or intended are good proxies or poor proxies for reproductive autonomy or empowerment. I think there was quite a strong consensus about developing a separate indicator rather than trying to modify or add to the existing one. And again, we'll confirm that consensus in the next round of survey. And then some questions, some very concrete questions about the metadata, how to capture all the women who are concerned, how to reconcile the timing of the survey if it's based on women's responses with their current state in the reproductive life course, how to capture changes over time, and who is this for. So very rich discussion and clear consensus to move forward and a lot to consider in so doing. The next construct is 1.2. It was articulated, it's a brand new request, aspirational, untested, and the original EPMM formulation was quite difficult to understand. It came from a public comment period and was ratified by the final consensus during EPMM phase 2. But here's how it was articulated originally. The number of district and local governments that articulate efforts of sectors accredited in its area and monitor results in each community. We did our best to try to distill out the critical construct contained in that request. And what we came up with was an indicator that holds local and district governments accountable for monitoring maternal health outcomes at the community level. So here's what you all thought about what was the critical component, the operative words or phrases that embody and define the construct for measurement in this gap in the slide below. And so community level monitoring came out very big, but also local government accountability and accountability around maternal health outcomes. So again, this kind of almost balance between community level monitoring and local government accountability. So let's see what the next slide shows us. The most potentially useful operational definition, the construct that best expresses the measurement gap. So here, interestingly, while community-based monitoring came out so strongly in the word cloud, the best expression of the gap focused a little bit more on accountability. So this is something, again, that the small groups, I think, the first thing to try and reconcile. And within accountability mechanisms, so more like process or evidence of responsiveness. And so there's sort of an even split, but that responsiveness of district governments to civil society representatives came out a little bit stronger. It's quite an even split, actually. So again, more things to discuss in the small groups, and also to try to get a little more clarity in the survey after this, during this week, the survey and the discussion. But again, very, very strong consensus that it's important to move forward and to try to articulate a definition with metadata. Some discussion points, again, these will be available for your small group to refer back to. There was some discussion about whether this measure, how this measure relates to one of the core phase 2 indicators around engagement of civil society organization representatives in national level planning. And so there are some words that are quite different: national level and planning of programs. What is the relationship between representation and inclusion, or reflection in accountability and monitoring at community level as well? So there was, there was quite a bit of discussion about the construct needs to go beyond monitoring, collection, and reviewing, but also responsiveness. And some further thoughts about that. Some thoughts about the optimal data custodian and data sources. So lots of things to think about, and some things that we'll try to narrow down a little bit in the ensuing discussion and the final poll before small groups break out next week. So this is the week to try to clarify. The next construct that we considered during Objective 2 was a new indicator, aspirational, untested, has to do with respectful maternity care. And the original formulation was the presence of a component that specifically addresses the universal rights of childbearing women, the RMC Charter, in the National Pre-Service Education curriculum for all midwifery service providers. We tried to hone in a little bit on that. It's quite similar. So the distillation that we attempted for the project was an indicator verifying that the National Pre-Service Education curriculum for maternal health workers includes standards for respectful maternity care. Let's see what you all thought was the most important piece. So the critical components, RMC standards came out very, very strongly, and then pre-service and maternal health workers. There's not too much variability, and again, not much here that diverges from the original request. So let's look at what you thought might be the best way to operationalize respectful maternity care. Here it was quite clear that both in the survey and I would say also in the discussion for this question, that the articles in the RMC Charter operationalized at provider level would provide a really good foundation. There was a little bit of a split between the best or the most useful platform for provider preparation and readiness. And this was also reflected in a very rich discussion around proxies for a national pre-service education curriculum in cases in recognition of the fact that there might not be a unified national curriculum. What would be some good proxies? And here, professional standards, core competencies, or a national certifying or licensure exam, which has perhaps the advantage of a periodic testing or recertification. And then finally, how should we define maternal health workers? And here it seems like the strongest response was for frontline maternity care providers disaggregated by cadre, which is similar to health worker density and distribution, which is another global workforce indicator. It's quite similar. There's a slight, it looks like head-to-head are doctors, nurses, and midwives, which is perhaps another way to articulate frontline health maternity care providers disaggregated by cadre, and then sort of a little bit more than a quarter of the people who responded felt that midwives would cover it. 100% of people who responded felt that we should move forward. So that's really the strongest support for any of the indicators constructs so far. Some discussion points for the small groups to consider as you move forward. Again, there was almost, I would say, unanimity in the feeling that the dimensions or articles or essential elements of the Respectful Maternity Care Charter provide a strong reference point, but need to be operationalized. And some question about whether we're actually ready, but it's sort of, I think which comes first, chicken or the egg. There are many, many indicators we use that haven't been validated yet, and validation can I think maybe be ongoing. Proxy for Unified National Pre-Service Education Curriculum, that's something that was discussed and needs to be, decisions need to be made. And then a little bit clarifying the construct. Here's where the discussion was quite interesting, I thought. So this is for national level, and it looks at provider readiness, provider preparation, and competency. And there were several approaches discussed, maybe different modalities for demonstrating competency during, for trainees, whether actual practice after education gets at the underlying concept of providers demonstrating competency, knowledge, skills, and behavior. What do you think? Is that a good proxy for preparedness and training? And then women's experiences. Now there's a question here. Is that too big of a leap to go from women's experiences, from provider readiness and competency to women's experiences? Is that the same construct? And what about normalization? What about, so there are things to think about in terms of the relationship, I think, between the ultimate outcome, which we all care about, and this construct, which was around training, preparedness, and experiences, exposure to RMC in pre-service. Some people put very concrete suggestions and proposals forward. I think small groups can look at them in the context of these issues, and I look forward to seeing how these small groups go. Finally, some thoughts about the preferred data custodian, whether professional associations are neutral or independent, whether ministries are, who's more accountable, and so forth. So that's an interesting thing to consider and discuss. Then finally, should this go beyond maternity care to all of sexual and reproductive health? I think that might be outside of the scope of this particular discussion, but certainly food for thought. And then there was quite a strong consensus on measuring using a score, particularly given the support for looking at all of the elements operationalized from the RMC charter. Finally, construct 4.2, the original, this again is a new aspirational untested indicator at national level looking at RMC, and the original request was for presence of respectful maternity care as a right in the National Health Plan or plans, and not very much difference in the way we tried to distill out the construct in the project, an indicator verifying that the National Health Plan includes the right to respectful maternity care. So those are quite similar, but not identical. Let's see what you thought. Again, not too much to try to, not too much variability because there's not too many words and not too much difference between the two formulations, but National Health Plan and the right to RMC as a right came out the most strongly. And then I think that the other additions are additive, are interesting, you know, at the structural level, how a right is realized, how to, how to make sure it's a real right. So let's see what the feelings were about the best options for expressing the measurement gap. And here it's interesting, there's a little bit of divergence again between here where it's around the National Health Plan and the right, and here where the results point to a fairly strong consensus toward evidence of completing all the steps and creating the conditions for exercise of a right to RMC as described by OHCHR, and that would seem to reflect some of those smaller words, but again, there weren't that many words to prioritize in the construct. So this is really around realization of rights. And then the second runner-up was the rights enshrined in the Charter are monitored and reported nationally. A small minority for including the rights and articles in the Charter in a national health plan or similar policy platform. So there, I think there's divergence that will need to be resolved through discussion in small groups where, National Health Plan came out very strong in the word cloud, but really this idea of realization of rights came out much more strongly in the measurement gap. So that will be for you all to resolve. Very, very strong consensus to move forward and try to articulate a definition and some things to consider for the small groups. So if the construct is around RMC as a right, how is that best measured? The sort of difference between the policy platform, sort of declarative at a policy level versus enforced, and National Health Plan as a platform versus legislation. The idea that, one point in this progression may not be sufficient. It may be necessary, but not sufficient. And so there was some discussion around a caveat that this is only one of a series that are needed, or maybe a composite indicator. There was quite a strong consensus that the RMC Charter articles as an ensemble are the way to go, and a score would be a good way to articulate that measurement. Is there a better proxy for a national health plan? Which is closer to implementation, a health plan or an enforceable law? What do we think about enforceability and responsiveness? And again, this divergence in the discussion about maybe national legislation is more appropriate than a statement of rights in a policy platform, but maybe the policy platform is the way to implement a right on the ground. So again, various diverging or sort of tension between those ideas. Feasibility, again, what's possible. Inclusion in a policy might be easier to assess than realization of a right. But then again, a very strong support for that completion of the OHCHR process, the steps and to create the conditions for realization of the right. And some recognition that attempts to measure realization of rights have been challenging. And then talk about the primary preferred data custodian. So with that, there's quite a lot to go on. I want to thank you again. The next steps for this week, it's a short week, and I thank you for your patience. We left the surveys and the discussions open until midnight on Sunday, which means that I had to, our team has worked very hard, and some of us have pulled some close to all-nighters to compile everything. So thank you for your patience. We hope that these presentations are helpful, and we really ask for your dedication and engagement in sort of teeing up the next step. The activities for this week are somewhat lighter, but very, very critical, honing in on the divergences in the discussion point, and then trying to poll to come to some consensus on what the exercise is. So we're working on the same things in the small groups. It's quite possible that your particular desire will not be the majority. So I ask you to think about what you could live with, and we framed the survey questions in that way. Can you live with the decisions? So think about it that way. And then please, if you would, make sure that you get into your small group and fill out your doodle poll so we can go ahead and schedule. That's a lot of cat herding. So thank you very much for making it as easy as possible. And we are so grateful to you. I think this has been incredibly rich and interesting to see all of the inputs and to consider, the deep thinking that's going on. So with that, many thanks to you, and may the fun begin.